a vision of the future that never properly arrived. Synthpop was an ever-present staple of the British charts in the early 1980s, a candy fusion of pop sus and technological invention. Its height reflected the increased affordability of commercial synthesizers from the late 70s onwards. But that doesn't mean that the likes of the Human League, Ultravox, OMD and Gary Newman were the first to splice synths and pop together. So who were the pioneers? What were the essential steps along the way, the key tracks and influences? And how did we get to the point where Our Friends Electric got to number 1? This is how synthpop became synthpop. One of the first pop songs to utilize electronic instrumentation was the original 1939 version of Vera Lynn's wartime standard, We'll Meet Again.
Don't know where, don't know when.
Accompanied by the synthetic string sound of the first commercially available polyphonic synthesizer, the Hammond Novacord. Many, mainly French experimentalists appeared in the 1950s. Composers like Pierre Schaeffer and Henri, playing with tape loops and musique concrète. US-based husband and wife team, Louis and Bibi Baron, soon realized there was little money in pure experimentation, and began accepting offers to create futuristic sound effects for film productions. In 1956, they created the first fully electronic feature score for Forbidden Planet. A contemporary in Britain was Daphne Oram. In 1957, she created the BBC's first all-electronic score for the play Amphitryon 38. The following year, she co-founded the BBC Radiophonic Workshop with fellow BBC composer Desmond Briscoe, which soundtracked the broadcaster's radio and TV documentaries and sci-fi programs with their own brand of electronic ambience. Oram also dipped into feature films, lending truly unnerving noises to 1961's The Innocents. On the more pop side of things, Del Shannon's Runaway from 1961 mixes primal rock and roll with a proto-synth-pop instrumental break, an eerie synthetic solo played on keyboardist Max Crook's self-modified clavioline, dubbed the Musitron. A year after, British studio whiz Joe Meek wrote and produced the satellite-themed Telstar by the Tornadoes. Complete with a killer organ line, bubbling sci-fi effects, and liftoff characterized by a toilet flush. In November 1963, with a vague melody composed by Ron Grainer, Delia Derbyshire of the Radiophonic Workshop realized the hauntingly futuristic theme for BBC sci-fi mainstay Doctor Who. Since the BBC did not acquire their first synthesizer until 1965, Derbyshire had to resort to other methods to create the theme. A bassline throb manufactured from the pluck of a single guitar string underlays the screaming yet melodic lead formed of test tones. Assembled from a meticulous process of tape splicing, pasting and looping, the sounds were inspired by memories of her childhood in Coventry, battered by the Blitz.
The sounds of the air raid sirens. It's an abstract sound. And it's meaningful. You know, there's the sound of the all clear. Well, that's sort of electronic music in those days.
Despite protests from Grainer, Derbyshire was denied a composition credit by BBC policy, which preferred the radiophonic engineers to remain anonymous. But amongst the shoddy aliens and robots, future British synth-poppers discovered the power of electronic music. By the latter half of the 60s, two of the decade's biggest pop groups were experimenting with electronic sounds. The Beach Boys' Brian Wilson hired electro-theremin inventor Paul Tanner to play an otherworldly solo on I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, from 1966's Pet Sounds. As well as on Good Vibrations a year later.
I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitation.
The Beatles were hot on their heels. Paul McCartney had intended to collaborate with Delia Derbyshire on Yesterday, even met in her workshop, but those plans came to nothing. The song instead backed by a George Martin-led string quartet.
Oh, I believe in yesterday.
1967's Strawberry Fields Forever featured a melody line played on a mellotron. A keyboard-based instrument that played short audio recordings at the touch of a key, in theory a proto-sampler. The mellotron was introduced to Lennon and McCartney by Mike Pinder of the Moody Blues, who would use it on their classical pop love declaration Nights in White Satin later the same year. It was around 1967 that one of the first true synthesizer heavyweights came into play, the Moog. The Beatles made use of this costly piece of kit on 1969's Abbey Road, most prominently on Because. But even before then, some brave artists assessed the viability of using this untested technology for pop. One was Gershon Kingsley. A Broadway conductor, he joined forces with French composer Jean-Jacques Perry to form Perry and Kingsley in 1965. Their 1967 album Kaleidoscopic Vibrations nobly reinterpreted film themes and pop songs with the help from the Moog, side by side with originals. Their most notable track, Baroque Hoedown, later served as the theme for Walt Disney World's Main Street Electrical Parade attraction. The first group to take the Moog on the road was Lothar and the Hand People. Lothar was the name of the band's theremin, and the Hand People were the humans that had to play it using their fingers. No doubt they were innovative, but the public wasn't ready. When Machines, their bizarre 1968 cover of the Manfred Mann tune,
They keep right on going.
Machines, they keep right on going.
was played on the Rate a Record segment of Dick Clark's American Bandstand, one listener asked what the lowest rating possible could be. Still, they found a modicum of success when their 8-minute Moog-splattered spoken word jam, 1969 Space Hymn, found favour with the more progressive-minded FM stations.
Backwards from 5 to 0. Deeper on every count.
Los Angeles experimentalists, the United States of America, lacked the budget to acquire a $10,000 Moog, so their 1968 self-titled debut employed oscillators, found sounds, and musical collage to embellish their countercultural rock and roll. New York Silver Apples pushed it even further, bypassing guitars for homemade electronics and trance-like drums. Oscillations from 1968 was a forward-looking, groovy mix of looping beats, detached harmonies, and oscillating drone, sounding unlike anything else in the 60s. Wendy Carlos was so intrinsic to the development of electronic music that even before she had released music herself, she was helping Robert Moog fine-tune his namesake synthesizer. Her first album, 1968's Switched on Bach, saw her rearrange a collection of the German Baroque composer's greatest hits for the Moog. At the time, the instrument was limited, frequently losing tuning and monophonic. As only one key made sound at a time, recording chords required multiple overdubs. On release, some classical purists saw it as sacrilege, but it was also only the second classical album to ever go platinum in the US. It introduced electronic music to many and proved it could be popular. Giorgio Moroder's love of electronic music started with this album. Carlos also provided the score for 1971's A Clockwork Orange. Originally, director Stanley Kubrick had attempted to use parts of Pink Floyd's Atom Heart Mother Suite to soundtrack his film. But Roger Waters had refused. Instead, Carlos refreshed Henry Purcell, Gioacchino Rossini, and Ludwig van in her Moog mode. Her synth choral version of the fourth movement of the latter's Ninth Symphony would be particularly influential on synthpop. To electronically reproduce human voices, she used a Spectrum follower, a primitive vocoder of hers and producer Rachel Elkind's own design. The famous Kraftwerk voice effect. It was pioneered here. Aside from constructing soundtracks for the BBC, Delia Derbyshire branched out with the proto-synth-pop concern, White Noise. Led by David Vorhaus, and featuring Derbyshire colleague Brian Hodgson. Their 1969 debut, An Electric Storm, was a poor-selling but fascinating dive into avant pop. Characterized by tape splicing invention, synth swells, and alien sounds. On Love Without Sound, Vorhaus's bass playing is manipulated to sound like violin and cello. Collaged amongst ominous echoes and disembodied voices. The most groundbreaking yet completely underrated electronic record of the 20th century. Its use of weird effects, stereo, and complex juxtapositions was completely out of this world. There's never been anything like it since. After Perry and Kingsley went their separate ways, Kingsley purchased his own Moog from Robert Moog himself, and released a showcase album for the instrument in 1969, Music to Moog By. Again, mostly covers, it was the original composition, Popcorn, that soon became a standard for electronic pop. While the album faced limited success, Popcorn became one of the first synth-pop hits when it was covered by Hot Butter in 1972. A group led by a former member of Kingsley's touring band, Stan Free. But a year before the hot buttered version of Popcorn popped onto the charts, Sly and the Family Stone claimed the first US #1 single to feature a drum machine, Family Affair, in March 1971. Stone would utilize the Maestro Rhythm King throughout its parent album, There's a Riot Going On, overdubbing the tracks multiple times for a more full, impactful sound. August 1971's Who's Next was The Who's stripped-down studio follow-up to their story-heavy concept double LP, Tommy. Its opening track, Barbara O'Reilly, was named after Pete Townshend's two biggest inspirations at the time, Guru Meher Baba and avant-garde composer Terry Riley. Its cycling drone was a nod to Riley, achieved through a low-ray organ on a marimba repeat setting. Townshend made use of his costly, newly acquired ARP 2500 elsewhere. The 8-minute synth and rock duel, Won't Get Fooled Again, even made it to number 8 on the UK charts. Despite The Who's noble efforts, the first UK #1 single to feature a synthesizer was in February 1972, Son of My Father by Chicory Tip. A cover of a minor 1971 hit by a pre-disco Giorgio Moroder. The memorable Moog refrain on the Chicory Tip version was played by Chris Thomas, and an important producer in his own right. King Crimson's 1969 debut, In the Court of the Crimson King, got all the main tenets of progressive rock in place. Ambitious, grandiose, musically accomplished, and experimental. Simply, it was classical, merged with rock. But the album's prominent use of the mellotron would make keyboards and later synthesizers an essential part of the prog rock template. After leaving King Crimson, Greg Lake hooked up with ex-Nice keyboardist Keith Emerson and ex-Atomic Rooster drummer Carl Palmer to form the creatively named Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Their first and biggest hit, 1970's Lucky Man, is the first hit single to feature a Moog solo. Ironically, Emerson hated his solo, as he was just jamming around to warm up, unaware that he wouldn't be allowed a second take. Yes fired keyboardist Tony Kaye early in the sessions for their 1971 landmark album Fragile due to his lack of interest in expanding the keyboard's role in the band. This opened the door for 21-year-old keyboard prodigy Rick Wakeman, who nailed Roundabout's iconic Hammond C3 solo in one take. What is even more important was the song's fleeting appearance of the Mini Moog. A quick fill that demonstrated the more user-friendly, affordable version of the Moog that would dominate the music of the 70s. Perhaps the ultimate space rock band, Hawkwind wasn't prog, so much as it was sci-fi rock and roll. The spacey electronic wash of Michael Dick Davies' EMS VCS 3 all but overwhelms everything else in the mix. And Simon King's thundering, reverb-heavy drums could easily be mistaken for the kind of drum machines that dominated electronic pop in the 80s. Pink Floyd had been messing around with synths since the late 60s. However, their 1973 album, The Dark Side of the Moon, is legendary for many reasons, not least the pioneering use of tape loops, studio trickery, and the group's two newly acquired EMS synthesizers. Electronic sounds helped define the album, but it's the dark, paranoid tones of On the Run that showed the world that synthesizers didn't need the help of more traditional instruments to make compelling music. Though Peter Gabriel and later Phil Collins were the public face of the band, keyboardist Tony Banks was the closest thing Genesis ever had to a leader. The group's early records were awash in organs and mellotrons until Banks got his first synthesizer, an ARP Pro soloist, in 1973. Later that year, he showed off his new toy on the Cinema Show. An 11-minute prog monolith with a synth solo that takes up half its runtime. In Germany, bands were taking homegrown psychedelia to strange new places. There was Neu with their synth washes and Klaus Dinger's relentless motoric beat. As well as the early, non-fully electronic Kraftwerk. But Can quickly became known as one of the most fearless and experimental of these groups. Ermin Smith's eerie, often atonal playing prefigured the dark, icy synths that came to define the darker end of synth pop. But it's 1972's bouncy, playful Spoon that provides undeniable proof that Can saw synth pop coming before anyone else. A supposed supergroup of the German experimental scene, Harmonia were the two members of former noisy proto-industrialists Cluster and Neu guitarist Michael Rother. Decamping to an idyllic farmhouse in East Germany, the musicians jammed out steady, droning rhythms with rudimentary sequences. Twinkling, blooping splatters of synth accenting the mix, resulting in 1974's Musik von Harmonia. Painfully obscure at the time, it was only after Brian Eno dubbed them the world's most important rock band, and they impacted the direction of his ambient rock albums, that Harmonia started to get some attention. Another component of the German experimental wave, Tangerine Dream only went fully electronic after synth manipulator Chris Franke joined. On their 1974 album, Thedra, their expansive instrumental music focused on leitmotifs and codas, synthetic swirls and chromatic ambience. Simply, it was psychedelic headphone music to space out to. And many did. Now signed to Virgin, this album of radio-unfriendly soundscapes managed to peak in the UK top 20. Similarly spacey was the work of Japan's Isao Tomita, intent on pushing the Moog to its absolute limits. On his debut 1972's Electric Samurai, Switched on Rock, he had synthesized the Beatles and Simon and Garfunkel. Even attempting to electronically recreate the human voice. But his follow-up saw him take 14 months to reinterpret the impressionist work of Debussy. Creating a heart-tuggingly beautiful polyphonic sound with painstaking overdubs. By the early 70s, more US pop acts were starting to utilize synth technology. Stevie Wonder had been a hitmaker since the age of 12. By 1971, he had attained full creative control from Motown and was interested in pushing sonic boundaries. He did this by using the original New Timbral Orchestra, or Tonto for short. It was a room-sized synthesizer designed by Malcolm Cecil and Bob Margouleff, an array of custom modules, a powerful combination of Moog and ARP, unlike anything else available at the time. The orchestral utility of Tonto had been showcased on the pair's lone album, Tonto's Expanding Headbands, Zero Time, from 1971. Unlike the early versions of the Moog, Tonto was made for music. It stayed in tune, allowed users to play full chords, and was able to realize all the sounds in his head. Drums and horns aside, 1972's Superstition is the sound of Tonto. Bass and keys controlled by Wonder's clavinet, hooked up to the synth, creating its unique sound. He would continue working with Tonto through the early 70s.
You are the sunshine of my life.
Others followed Wonder's lead through the mid-70s, the chill tones of the Isley Brothers version of Summer Breeze.
Sweet days of summer, the jasmine's in bloom.
The ambient twinkles on Minnie Riperton's Loving You.
Loving you is easy 'cause
And the whistling funk solo from Quincy Jones's Body Heat. One of several people manning a synth on Jones's Body Heat album was avant jazz musician Herbie Hancock, another early adopter of the technology. On 1973's Headhunters, he fused his jazz with funk. Its opening track, Chameleon, powered by a colourful, deep Arp Odyssey bass line. Six minutes in, leading to Hancock's cosmic synth solo, playing off kinetic drums and prefiguring disco and pretty much all electronic dance music. Another extended synth jam from 1973, though more on the rock side of the musical spectrum, was the Edgar Winter Group's Frankenstein. A 4-minute instrumental, it got its name from its editing method, cut and pasted together from myriad takes, like Victor Frankenstein and his monster. Employing a screaming ARP 2600, it was the first synth-led song to top the US Billboard chart. Sick of being seen as the male Carole King, Todd Rundgren dove headfirst into psychedelic drugs and synths. In March 1973, he unleashed the eclectic, self-produced double LP, A Wizard, a True Star. The acid-fried whooshes and jarring edits of International Feel, showing just how far he'd travelled from the power pop of 13 months prior. In contrast to Rundgren, Gary Wright was a synth-based singer-songwriter with an eye on the charts.
Fly me high through the starry sky.
On Dreamweaver from the tail end of 1975, only the drums were real. Its spacey sonics and soaring ARP strings, earning him a Billboard Hot 100 number 2.
Ooh, Dreamweaver.
When Roxy Music played their debut on Top of the Pops, with Virginia Plain in 1972, synthhead Brian Eno was barely shown.
Your roller coaster. Take me for an airplane ride.
Tapping away on his EMS VCS-3, his main contribution seemed to consist of a few simplistic keyboard parts that hardly qualify as solos. His actual role within the band didn't make for exciting TV. He provided treatments to the other instruments as they played, twisting random knobs and subtly altering the overall feel of the track. While Eno's contributions didn't add up to much screen time, he was impossible to ignore on the albums. Editions of You from the band's 1973 second album, For Your Pleasure, features what is still one of the most unreal synthesizer solos committed to tape, shrieking and warbling like a spaceship that was about to make a crash landing. It was a wake-up call for many musicians, including some who would work with Eno in the coming years. I didn't want my instrument to sound like Rick Wakeman or Keith Emerson, who were doing synthesizers and didn't really carry any weight or personality. The one person in pop music I felt a camaraderie with was Brian Eno. When I heard his synthesizer solo in Editions of You, it made the hair on my arm stand up. I was like, he's done it. This guy, we're of common thought. We had ideas in common. Eno's sonic absurdity, outdone only by his ridiculous stage costumes that made him look like a distressed peacock, attracted so much attention that the band's mastermind, Brian Ferry, understandably felt he was being upstaged. One thing led to another, and a mere 2 years after his first meeting with Roxy Music, Eno found himself at Majestic Studios in London, recording Here Come the Warm Jets, his solo debut. He had made some impressive friends in those 2 years, including one who would become a regular collaborator, King Crimson guitarist Robert Fripp. The few boundaries that Eno had in Roxy Music were gone, and everything on Here Come the Warm Jets is chopped, processed, and mutilated within an inch of its life. Babies on Fire is jam-packed with altered sounds.
Baby's on fire, better throw her in the water.
But the song's centerpiece is Robert Fripp's 3-minute guitar solo, which quickly goes from being recognizably guitar into something completely otherworldly. But Eno's strangely gentle third album, 1975's Another Green World, was when he let the synthesizer be its own instrument, albeit one that was still subjected to his treatments. Although his main setup at the time consisted of a VCS-3 and a Mini Moog, there seems to be no consensus on precisely what he used for many of the album's tracks. The Big Ship, a broad, soaring instrumental, still manages to sound like a lullaby. Whatever was used, it was a startling new sonic landscape that was both artificial and familiar, a warm counterpoint to the intentionally cold robot pop of Kraftwerk. "1974's Autobahn was the moment Kraftwerk moved away from their long-haired German experimentalist cohorts like Can, Neu, and Tangerine Dream. Gone were their psychedelic hippieisms and most of their organic instruments, replaced by a stoic irony that would eventually lead to the band wearing press suits, itself a satire on Teutonic professionalism. And though its title track clocked in at a mammoth 22 minutes, it revelled in hooks, lyrical refrains, and accidental allusions to the Beach Boys. This was synthpop. Autobahn was about finding our artistic situation. Where are we? What is the sound of the German Bundesrepublik? Because at this time bands were having English names and not using the German language. Using a combination of commercial synths like the Mini Moog, EMS Synthi, and ARP Odyssey, as well as their own self-designed electronics, such as their famous electronic drums. They created a symphonic, tone-film tribute to German motorways. Mechanized rhythms evoke the idea of transit, freewheeling down the highway in a Volkswagen Beetle, synthesizing the sound of other cars Dopplering away. The slight aural difference of driving on paint while changing lanes. Being as they were from industrial Dusseldorf, this was folk music of the factories, as Bowie succinctly put it. In 1974, Autobahn sounded like the future. For the most part though, critics didn't really get their appeal. In a particularly scathing NME review, it was noted as dimly fumbling for approachability, for simple minds only. Surprisingly, the radio edit of Autobahn crept to number 11 on the UK chart. But their first UK TV appearance wasn't on Top of the Pops. Instead, stuffy new technology show, Tomorrow's World. Das Model from 1978's The Man Machine would condense their style down into a 3-minute pop song, a template for future synth-pop hits. But their influence goes way beyond that. Every single electronic act since has been impacted by Kraftwerk. As the 1970s reached its midpoint, synthesizer technology was becoming increasingly common in the European charts. Sweden's ABBA cast off the novelty associations of their 1974 Eurovision win to become chart behemoths and pop innovators in their own right. After having heard Hot Butter's Popcorn, Co-songwriter Benny Andersson bought a Mini Moog, and with it quickly became adept at flavouring their often melancholic Europop. The sweeping pseudo-string solo of Honey Honey, the bubbling pre-chorus run of SOS, and the shimmering, phased chords of Knowing Me, Knowing You. Somewhat surprisingly, Kraftwerk were bigger in France than their native land, but it does explain the surfeit of late 70s French synth acts. Using a barely functional Mellotron and an EMS VCS3, Jean-Michel Jarre conjured otherworldly white noise soundscapes, combined with actual hummable synth refrains, most prominently on Oxygen Part 4. Initially, its lack of traditional instrumentation, singing, or actual song titles got the album rejected by numerous record labels, them being unsure how to market it. But finally released in December 1976, Oxygen has gone on to sell 15 million copies worldwide, and is the most successful French album of all time. Another France-sourced international mega hit was Space's Magic Fly from April 1977. Composed to front a cancelled TV show about astrology, and inspired by the ambient soundscapes of Tangerine Dream, it was only after they added a disco beat that label saw its commercial potential. For the promotional material, the band wore a sound-appropriate cosmonaut getup, mostly to hide the identity of its songwriter, Didier Moroni, a pop singer and composer with contract disputes on his mind. It went number 2 in the UK, denied the top spot by the recent passing of Elvis Presley, and spawned the subgenre of space disco. A well-known French disco orchestrator, Marc Chironnet dealt in traditional organic instrumentation, as heard on his international smash, Love in C Minor. When recording a new album in 1977, ARP sent him an Odyssey out of the blue, a gift if he used it and credited it on his next LP. Supernature was Chironnet trying to get his head around this new music machine. After taking 10 minutes to find the on switch, he accidentally activated the sequencer, which gave the song its insistent foundation. Adding bass and drums made it a dance floor smash. With Birmingham, England's Electric Light Orchestra, Jeff Lynne's plan was to continue what the Beatles started, a sneak peek into an alternative universe, where the Beatles' experiments with the Moog flourished into spacey symphonic pop. 1977's double LP Out of the Blue showcased a plethora of cutting-edge technology, but none so impressively as on Mr. Blue Sky.
Mr. Blue Sky, please tell us why you had to hide away for so long.
ELO's trademark harmonies trade space with the robotic sounds of the prototype Vocoder 2000, voicing the song's title. Tradition and future trading blows. But they weren't afraid of low-tech solutions. That tinny cowbell? That's ELO drummer Bev Bevan whacking a fire extinguisher.
It's a beautiful new day. Hey.
When George Clinton's Parliament released their commercial breakthrough, 1975's Mothership Connection, keyboardist Bernie Worrell had embraced synthesizers with a passion, adding a Mini Moog and 2 ARP synths, the Pro Soloist and the String Ensemble.
Well, alright, ain't nothing but a party.
The new focus on synths fit perfectly with Clinton's decision to fully adopt what would be called the P-Funk mythology, a loose concept inspired by both the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's and The Who's Tommy. But rather than a deaf, dumb and blind child, or a fictional band led by Billy Shears. The P-Funk mythology was a loose collective of cartoonish, satirical characters with names like Sir Nose, Starchild, and Mr. Wiggles. But in space.
Starchild, citizens of the universe, recording angels. We have returned to claim the pyramid.
The Afrofuturism provided the perfect context for Worrell's synth explorations, which reached their peak with 1977's Flashlight. A landmark recording that fused dance, synths, science fiction, and characterization in ways that define popular music to this day. But it's the bass line that was truly revolutionary. Using 3 or 4 depending on who you ask, linked mini-moogs, Worrell took a line originally written for P-Funk bassist Bootsy Collins and created something that could not only do the bass player's job, but take it in directions that even a master player like Collins couldn't have managed. The mini-moogs allowed the bass line to transition seamlessly from the funky low end to the track's famous quivering ray gun noise and back again without ever breaking stride. Kraftwerk may have pushed the idea of synth-based pop into the spotlight, but with Flashlight, Parliament infused it with a colourful, mischievous glee that could go in any direction. Quite the musical chameleon, David Bowie had always seemed to forewarn his next shift on the album before. On 1976's Station to Station, it was the epic avant-garde funk of the title track that pointed toward what is now known as the Berlin Trilogy. Physically and financially drained by the cocaine travails of the Thin White Duke era, Bowie relocated just west of the Berlin Wall to Hansa Studios with producer Tony Visconti, Brian Eno, and Iggy Pop in tow. It was here he created Low, his spin on the German experimentalists. Side A was a refreshing synergy of the rhythmic electronica of Kraftwerk and the art pop invention and ambience of Eno's Another Green World.
Always crashing in the same car.
Side B reflected Bowie's titular mood all the better, an almost wordless Tangerine Dream-esque sequence of desolate instrumentals, the moments where Eno would truly spin magic with his EMS synthy, AKS. The second part of the trilogy, Heroes, appeared 9 months later, with King Crimson's Robert Fripp providing the guitars, and the pulsating drone of the title track, furthering the art-pop electronica fusion. Originally, Bowie claimed the song's lyrics were provoked by him observing 2 nameless German lovers kiss by the wall, stealing a moment of affection in that oppressive setting.
Oh, we can be heroes just for one day.
But it was actually about Visconti and his secret girlfriend. Because I was married at the time, David protected me all these years by not saying that he saw Antonia and me kiss by the wall. He asked to be left alone to write the lyrics, and we took a walk by the wall. Bowie would be a key influence on the future synth pop and new romantic waves. Low and Heroes held up as essential texts in experimental electronica. Donna Summer and Giorgio Moroder sealed their working relationship with Summer's 1975 album, Love to Love You Baby, and its sidelong orgasm of the title track. And producer Moroder took advantage of that song's smash success to take on bigger ideas as the partnership continued. I Remember Yesterday was a concept album. As the LP progresses, merging disco with music of prior decades, the 50s, 60s, 70s. Final track, I Feel Love, is his vision of the future, showing just how old world Star Wars' Cantina Band the same year sounded. Disco was the dominant chart sound of the late 70s. It necessitated ensembles of session musicians to make this syncopated dance music possible. Rarities like Cloud One's 1976 hit, Atmosphere Strut, would employ prominent synth lines to complement their flesh and blood players. But by contrast, almost everything on I Feel Love was handled by machines. The only organic elements were Summer's seductive voice and the bass drum. The contrast between the cold robotic backing and her warm, alive voice is the appeal. Unstoppably kinetic, its pulsating bassline and rigid mechanical backbeat is like Neu! Or Kraftwerk, if their only purpose was to compel people to dance. When we mixed it, by accident their engineer added a delay at the same tempo as the beat, which suddenly doubled the speed of the synth pulse. That became the key sound of the record. When it was released in July 1977, Brian Eno instantly heard it as the shape of disco to come, rushing to play it to Bowie as they worked on Heroes. Not only was it the framework for Italo disco, EDM, acid house, techno, high energy, electroclash, and new disco, but for synth pop purposes, any band that made you want to dance, i.e. most of them, took notes from I Feel Love. Another I Feel Love convert was Sylvester, a former Pentecostal boy turned brazenly out disco diva. His big hit experienced a similar transformation. Originally a slow gospel song about living free, it was Patrick Cowley's production on October 1978's You Make Me Feel Mighty Real that turbocharged it to gay anthem status. San Francisco transplant, Cowley had his ears on the sounds of Europe. Though unlike Moroder, who rarely drank, Cowley was also deep in the disco club scene, his productions reflecting the desires of the dancers. As such, its bouncy synths, persistent sequencing, and Sylvester's fearless falsetto paved the way for the house and high-energy scenes. New York Suicide had been pissing off rock crowds since 1970, consisting of Firebrand frontman Alan Vega and synth smasher Martin Rev. They were the template for many a synth duo to come. Rev's method of playing, smashing, punching, and all-round assaulting his instrument proved that you didn't need to be Rick Wakeman or Stevie Wonder to create electronic music.
He's a screaming the truth.
But it wasn't all abrasive synth-punk noise. On their 1977 self-titled debut, they even assembled something akin to a twinkling love song with Cherie, what John Lydon would later describe as Je t'aime, with tape hiss.
Cherie, Cherie.
Akron, Ohio's Devo also formed in 1970, after Gerald Casale and Mark Mothersbaugh witnessed their classmates get gunned down during the peaceful protests of Kent State. Scrambling to make sense of the country's slide into fascism, Casale settled on a theory of de-evolution, that humanity had stopped going forward and was actually regressing. Devo was their imagined soundtrack to society's downfall, mechanized rock and roll hewn to its caveman essence. Flavored with Enoized, atonal synth parts. I used to write synth parts I could play with a fist instead of fingers. We were looking for sounds like V2 rockets and mortar blasts, things that weren't on the settings when you bought a synth. Devo were a hit with a Hansa set. They were declared the future by Bowie. Iggy Pop wanted to do a cover album of their songs, and Eno produced their 1978 debut, Are We Not Men, We Are Devo, flying them out to Germany on his own dime, trusting that this label-less band would pay off. Whip It was still 2 years away.
Now whip it into shape. Shape it up. Get straight.
At the initial test screening of John Carpenter's 1978 indie slasher Halloween, no one thought it was scary. At the time, it lacked a score, which the director would remedy over 3 days, with a Prophet 5 synthesizer, and the scores of Suspiria and The Exorcist on his mind. Teaming with synth whiz Dan Wyman, the self-confessed musically illiterate Carpenter devised the discordant synth stabs, ominous sense of dread bass, and pounding metronomic beats that would make audiences scream. Not only influential to horror cinema, the soundtrack was a pioneering moment in the development of synthwave. By the late 70s, synth-based soundtracks were becoming more and more commonplace. Tangerine Dream had already used their hypnotic space music to back Sorcerer in 1977. Kickstarting a series of high-profile feature scores, Giorgio Moroder lent his insistent sequence beats to 1978's Midnight Express. And Vangelis, the Greek synth wunderkind, was also at it. After a cut from his Heaven and Hell album was used to front Carl Sagan's Cosmos series in 1980, it led him to create the acclaimed scores for Chariots of Fire and Blade Runner soon after. Yellow Magic Orchestra was supposed to be a one-off project, joining together Happy End's Hiromi Hari Hosono, Yukihiro Takahashi from Sadistic Mika Band, and up-and-coming producer-composer Ryuichi Sakamoto, using Hosono's recently acquired Roland MC8 sequencer and Yamaha CP30 synth. In 1978, they attempted a cover of Martin Denny's Firecracker. The idea was to subvert the original composition's Western appropriation of their culture, this fetishization of Japan, which their band name also confronted. After a handful of unproductive sessions, inspiration struck in the form of a tabletop Space Invaders game. Computer Game, the lead-off track from the band's self-titled debut, is precisely what it says. The sound of several video games, including of course Space Invaders, all being played at once, like in an arcade. The album was a hit, so much so that it was released outside their home country, then highly unusual for a Japanese pop album. It gained them an international audience, with the single Computer Game Firecracker hitting the top 20 in both the UK singles chart and the US R&B chart. Yellow Magic Orchestra remain a household name in their home country, are pioneers in synth pop, and one of the first Japanese groups to impact Western music, not just for pop, but video game music as well. (1977) was when Britain took its first proper steps into synth pop. In Hull, Throbbing Gristle were experimenting with the synth part, but what they were making was defiantly not pop. In London was Ultravox, currently with an exclamation mark. Initially they were an art rock group in the vein of Roxy Music. But after hearing I Feel Love, the group bought an ARP Odyssey synth and a Roland drum machine, and started towards a more synth pop direction. Closing their fairly punky 1977 Ha 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 album was the romantic synth ballad Hiroshima Mon Amour.
Hiroshima, mon amour.
combining their electric violin with a preset salsa beat and soaring synth under John Foxx's poignant lyricism.
Walk through Polaroids of the past, features fused like shattered glass.
Hiroshima Mon Amour stands as the first proper UK synth-pop track. Sheffield's The Human League formed in 1977. Their first single, 1978's Being Boiled, was created for merely £2.50. Its extremely odd lyricism loomed on top of a fully synthetic sci-fi instrumental. Distorted by guitar pedals and propelled by an oh-so-danceable synth-bass riff. Abrasive, minimal, but definitely pop. Bowie, John Peel and Vince Clarke were fans, inspiring the latter to form Depeche Mode. Optimistic frontman Phil Oakey assumed it would be a top 10 smash, but it missed the chart entirely on first release. Only after their December 1981 mega hit Don't You Want Me did Being Boiled get its moment of chart glory. In 1978, London's Daniel Miller was in a transitional phase. He'd just broken up with his girlfriend, had become obsessed with J.G. Ballard's book Crash, and was energized by the punk movement happening around him. Problem was, he couldn't play guitar.
The thing that pissed me off about punk was you had to learn 3 chords to be in a punk band. If you had a synthesizer, all you had to do is press one key with a finger, you know.
After buying a Korg 700S and renting a studio for a day, he created Warm Leatherette. It was the confrontational sound of punk, the era synth.
Warm Leatherette. Warm.
A dentist drill of a riff, pummeling the listener, while Miller, in a deadpan tone, recounts evocative aspects of Ballard's book.
Quick. Let's make love before you die.
Miller self-released it as The Normal on his label Mute in November 1978. It acted as a spiral scratch for synth pop. It showed that anyone could do this, while its abrasive sonics helped calcify the industrial genre. The band Japan assembled too late to be included in the glam rock party. Taking his surname from the New York Dolls' Syl Sylvian, frontman David Sylvian assumed a similarly androgynous appearance and sneer. 1979 was when the band started musically moving toward a synth-pop identity. Impressed with Giorgio Moroder's soundtrack for Midnight Express, the group collaborated with the king of synth disco on their April single, Life in Tokyo. His trademark propulsive repetition made Sylvian's Brian Ferryisms danceable, and forewarned the discoed new romanticism of Duran Duran. When Kraftwerk first played the UK in 1975, a young Liverpool band called Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark was so transfixed that they threw away their guitars and bought synthesizers. After a few years of learning how their mini Korgs worked, they appeared with their debut single, Electricity. Essentially a reworking of the Kraftwerk track, Radioactivity. Albeit with a pop song structure, actual chorus, and way peppier synth line. It was released by Manchester's Factory Records in May 1979. The tragedy was that even though all these songs were important first steps for British synth pop, none of them charted. The popular part of synth pop would be resolved soon. Brothers Ron and Russell Mael, the only constant members of the band Sparks, had always been Anglophiles. In 1974, their dream of making it big in the UK came true when the glam rock scene embraced their first hit, This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us.
This town ain't big enough for the both of us. Tell me who's gonna leave.
Other hits followed, but after a couple years they returned to the US, hoping to stop a small but noticeable decline in their popularity. When the ironically named Introducing Sparks flopped, they decided to start from scratch. When they joked about working with Giorgio Moroder in a promotional interview for the failed album, the journalist offered to put them in touch for real. To their surprise, Moroder was interested, but but nobody else was, and it's not difficult to see why. Introducing Sparks had been a resounding failure, and while Moroder was still considered wildly successful, his reputation was synonymous with disco, which was beginning to feel the first sting of backlash after Saturday Night Fever had all but overwhelmed popular culture. It didn't help that the album, Number One in Heaven, was drastically different from anything Sparks had done before, and to the music world at the time, they weren't even really a band anymore. Just two brothers who couldn't admit their career was over, trying to jump on the disco bandwagon, just as it was running out of steam. Finally, after shopping the complete album around for months, Virgin Records decided to take the plunge, releasing the album in March 1979. The first single, La Dolce Vita, went nowhere. The second attempt was the celestial electro disco or the pseudo title track, which quickly made the UK top 20, revitalized Sparks' career, played a major role in bringing synthpop to the mainstream, and set the template for virtually every synthpop duo since, the charismatic singer and the stoic synth player. Despite its title, it never got to number one, but a few months later Gary Numan would. Tubeway Army were a London punk band. In 1978, when in the studio recording their first album, their frontman, Gary Numan, happened upon a mini Moog. I just pressed a key for whatever it was set on, and it made that famous Moog sound, that famous low growl, and the room vibrated. It was the most powerful thing. It was like an earthquake, and I just loved it. And before the band was even finished setting up the gear, I was in there working on changing the songs we'd arrived with into pseudo-electronic songs. Energized by this discovery, he changed everything. In April 1979, Tubeway Army released Our Friends Electric. This song, with its almost malfunctioning synth riff, somehow connected with the listening public. Few were aware that the song was about a robot prostitute from the future. But it was no instant smash, entering the UK charts at number 71. Their fortunes changed when the band appeared on Top of the Pops. Dressed all in black, moon-white face shining in the studio light, Numan peering bleakly into the middle distance. He looked almost like a synthetic himself.
So now I'm alone. Now I can think for myself.
And that performance got the single and its album Replicas both to number one. Tubeway Army would dissolve straight after, Numan preferring to release music under his own name. Cars would arrive in September the same year. Again getting to number one in the UK, as well as getting to number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 in June 1980. Synthpop was now mainstream. The next half-decade would be devoted to British synthpop, building on the work of their predecessors, where groups like Visage, The Buggles, Spandau Ballet, Soft Cell, Depeche Mode, Duran Duran, Eurythmics, Thomas Dolby, New Order, Bronski Beat, Talk Talk, Tears for Fears, and Pet Shop Boys took over the charts. It was the future Eno, Bowie and Moroder had envisioned, become real. A vision that lives on today in the work of Churches, M83, LCD Soundsystem, Charlie XCX, Magdalena Bay, Dua Lipa and so many more. It took a while for people to understand this new, synthetic music, but since then, we have all been assimilated. Thanks for watching. So what did I inevitably miss out? Comment down below. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and why don't you also maybe watch another one? There's a few other excellent videos on synthpop. As always, I'd like to shout out this month's new top tier supporter over on Patreon. An extra special thanks to Jay Henry, and thanks to everyone else that supports me. And I'll see you in 3 weeks' time for a little more synthpop.